The Master Key They Never Explained. Charles Haanel. There is an odd pattern that appears throughout the history of ideas. Most influential books become famous because people understand them. Every generation reads them, quotes them, builds upon them. Eventually, their central message becomes almost impossible to separate from the culture itself. But every once in a while, a different kind of book appears, a book that becomes enormously influential, while simultaneously becoming deeply misunderstood. Its reputation grows, its sales continue, its name survives for generations, and yet the question the author was actually trying to answer slowly disappears beneath everything later readers assumed it was about. Charles Francis Haanel's The Master Key System may be one of those books. Today, it is usually introduced with familiar labels, a classic of personal development, an early manifestation manual, a foundation of the law of attraction, a secret influence on Napoleon Hill. Each description contains part of the story. None of them explains something that becomes impossible to ignore once you read the original lessons in the order Haanel intended. Because the strangest thing about the Master Key System is not what it teaches, it is where it begins. Imagine receiving the first lesson in the mail. The year is 1912. The airplane has only recently proven that powered flight is possible. The Ford Model T is transforming transportation. Psychology is still a young discipline. Electricity is changing the modern city. Across America, thousands of ambitious businessmen, lawyers, physicians, engineers, and entrepreneurs are searching for an advantage in a rapidly changing world. One day, an envelope arrives. Inside is the first lesson of a course that promises to reveal what its author calls the Master Key. You expect practical advice, perhaps financial strategy, perhaps leadership, perhaps persuasive communication. Instead, the very first instruction asks you to sit quietly, completely still. Do not move. Observe your own mind. Return tomorrow. At first, it feels almost absurd. Why would a man who spent years designing a complete system for success begin with an exercise that appears to accomplish nothing? That question is where most modern discussions quietly move on. This documentary begins there. Because the more closely you examine Charles Haanel's work, the stranger its architecture becomes. For nearly an entire month, he postpones the subjects readers are most eager to reach: visualization, achievement, prosperity, influence. Instead, he insists on something else: attention, concentration, observation, mental discipline, almost as though he believed these abilities were not merely helpful, but absolutely indispensable. That raises a possibility few people ever consider. What if the Master Key System was never primarily about manifestation? What if manifestation was simply the visible consequence of mastering something much more fundamental? If that sounds like an unusual interpretation, it is worth remembering that Haanel himself rarely described his work as a collection of inspirational ideas. He called it a system. That word deserves careful attention. A system is not a list. It is not a philosophy. It is not a collection of interesting observations. A system is an arrangement in which every part depends upon every other part. Remove the foundation, and everything above it becomes unstable. Perhaps that is exactly what happened to the Master Key System. Over the last century, readers remembered its conclusions, but gradually forgot the sequence that made those conclusions possible. Imagine discovering the scattered pieces of a remarkable machine inside an abandoned workshop. The gears are still there, the springs, the levers, the polished brass components. Every individual piece appears complete, yet the machine itself no longer functions. Not because anything is missing, because no one remembers how the pieces were originally assembled. This documentary is an attempt to rebuild that machine, not to prove Charles Haanel right, not to defend every claim he ever made. Ideas deserve examination, not unquestioning admiration. Instead, we are going to reconstruct the architecture of his thinking exactly as he presented it. Lesson by lesson, principle by principle, question by question. Along the way, we will place Haanel back into the world that shaped him, the industrial optimism of early 20th century America, the rise of psychology, the New Thought movement, the correspondence school revolution that allowed ordinary people to study sophisticated ideas from their own homes. We will compare his methods with what modern psychology has discovered about attention, self-regulation, habit formation, and deliberate practice. Not because contemporary science proves Haanel correct, but because it helps illuminate the practical human problems he was trying to solve. And perhaps most importantly, we will follow the order he believed mattered. Because there is one fact about the master key system that almost no one mentions. Charles Haanel did not write a book. He designed a training program. 24 weeks, 24 lessons, each one preparing the next, each one strengthening a capacity before asking the reader to depend upon it. That decision alone should make us pause. No engineer constructs the roof before laying the foundation. No musician begins with the concert performance. No architect starts with decoration. Why, then, would Haanel begin by asking readers to sit perfectly still? Unless stillness was never the destination. It was the first measurement, a way of answering a question most of us never think to ask. Can you actually direct your own attention? Or does your attention already belong to whatever captures it first? The answer to that question, if Haanel was right, changes the meaning of everything that follows. Because perhaps the master key was never hidden inside the world. Perhaps it was hidden inside the ordinary faculties we use every day, without ever fully learning how to govern them. And that is where our investigation begins. Act 1. The man who built a machine instead of a book. If Charles Haanel had intended to write another inspirational book, history would probably have forgotten him. The early 20th century was overflowing with optimistic writers. New philosophies appeared almost monthly. Magazines promised prosperity. Lectures promised confidence. Publishers competed to satisfy an enormous public appetite for self-improvement. Most of those books disappeared. Haanel's did not. That alone deserves an explanation, because books usually survive for one of two reasons. Either they capture a timeless truth, or they introduce a way of thinking that later generations continue borrowing, often without realizing where it came from. The master key system managed to do both. Yet understanding why requires looking beyond the book itself. It requires looking at the man who designed it. Charles Francis Haanel was born in 1866, during one of the most transformative periods in American history. The Civil War had just ended. Railroads were stitching together a continent. Factories were redefining work. Scientific discoveries were reshaping everyday life at extraordinary speed. For the first time, many people genuinely believed that almost everything, even human potential, could be studied, organized, improved, and systematically developed. That optimism shaped an entire generation. It also shaped Haanel. Unlike many spiritual writers of his era, Haanel did not emerge from a monastery, a university, or a theological institution. He came from the business world. That fact is surprisingly easy to overlook. But once you notice it, the structure of the master key system begins making much more sense. Business rewards systems. Factories depend upon systems. Successful organizations survive because complicated processes are broken into smaller, repeatable procedures. The same logic appears throughout Haanel's work. He rarely asks readers simply to believe. Instead, he repeatedly asks them to practice. Observe, repeat, measure. Return tomorrow. Improve gradually. His language often resembles instruction more than inspiration, and perhaps that is why the course feels so unusual even today. It was never designed to be admired. It was designed to be completed. That distinction changes almost everything. Imagine purchasing a beautifully illustrated manual on physical fitness. You place it on a shelf. You underline your favorite passages. You recommend it to friends. Years later, the pages remain pristine. No exercise was ever performed. Would anyone seriously claim the program failed? Of course not. The program was never attempted. Haanel appears to have worried about exactly this problem. He understood something that teachers, musicians, surgeons, and athletes have always known. Information alone rarely changes behavior. Practice does, which explains one of the strangest decisions in the entire course. Readers were never meant to consume all 24 lessons in a single weekend. In fact, Haanel actively discouraged it. Each lesson arrived separately, 1 week at a time. Not because the remaining material was secret, because he believed premature knowledge could become another form of distraction. That idea sounds almost counterintuitive today. Modern culture encourages acceleration. Read faster, finish sooner, consume more, move on to the next thing. Haanel proposed something very different. He slowed learning down on purpose. He insisted that understanding should mature at the same pace as the capacities required to use it. At first, that sounds inefficient, until you compare it with almost every meaningful skill human beings develop. No one learns surgery by reading continuously for 3 days. No one becomes a concert pianist by studying every lesson before touching the keyboard. No language is mastered by memorizing a dictionary in one sitting. Knowledge accumulates. Practice reorganizes the person receiving that knowledge. Only then does ability begin to emerge. Perhaps Haanel believed the mind deserved exactly the same patience. There is another clue hidden inside the structure of his course, something that almost disappears if we focus only on its individual lessons. Every week prepares the next. Stillness prepares observation. Observation prepares attention. Attention prepares concentration. Concentration prepares imagination. Imagination prepares intention. Intention prepares action. Action, repeated over time, reshapes character. Once you notice that progression, the course no longer resembles a collection of philosophical reflections. It resembles engineering. Each lesson functions like another gear inside a carefully assembled mechanism. Remove one, and everything after it begins losing stability. This may explain one of the greatest misconceptions surrounding the Master Key system. Many readers remember its most dramatic ideas. Few remember the order that made those ideas meaningful. Imagine dismantling a precision watch. Place every spring, wheel, and screw across a table. Nothing is missing. Every individual component remains perfectly intact. Yet the watch no longer tells time. Not because one piece is defective, because the relationship between the pieces has disappeared. Over the last century, something remarkably similar may have happened to Haanel's work. His ideas survived, his architecture slowly faded. And perhaps that is why so many people have read the Master Key system, while so few have experienced the system Charles Haanel believed they were actually practicing. If that observation is correct, then we have not yet reached the first lesson. Not really. Because before examining any exercise, we first need to understand the principle that governs every exercise that follows. A principle so ordinary that it almost escapes attention, yet one Haanel appears to treat as the foundation beneath everything else. He believed that before a person could consciously direct a life, they first had to discover whether they could consciously direct a single moment of attention. That sounds almost trivial until you try it. And that is exactly where Haanel asks us to begin. Act 2. The experiment. Almost everyone underestimates. There is an old principle that appears again and again throughout the history of science. Before attempting to change a system, observe it. Astronomers spent centuries watching the night sky before they understood the movement of planets. Naturalists filled notebooks with careful observations long before biology became a formal science. Physicians learned to recognize patterns of illness decades before they understood the microscopic causes behind them. Again and again, the same sequence appears. Observation comes before explanation. Charles Haanel adopted exactly the same approach. Only his laboratory was not the night sky, or the human body, or the natural world. His laboratory was attention itself. This is why the opening exercise of the Master Key system feels so unusual. It is not presented as a mystical ritual, nor as a religious practice, nor even as a method of relaxation. It is presented almost like an experiment. Sit comfortably, become completely still, relax every muscle you can consciously relax, then remain motionless. No unnecessary movement, no shifting positions simply because the body requests it, no scratching an itch the instant it appears, no following every thought simply because it demands to be followed. Simply observe. That is all. Read those instructions quickly, and they appear almost disappointingly ordinary. Perform them honestly, and something unexpected begins to happen. At first, nothing. The room is quiet, your breathing settles. You assume the exercise will be easy. Then, the body begins negotiating. One shoulder wants to move. An itch suddenly appears where none existed a moment before. A foot becomes uncomfortable. The mind immediately offers a perfectly reasonable explanation. You can adjust your position just once. Then another thought arrives. You're probably doing this correctly already. Another follows. This is taking longer than expected. Then, without quite noticing how it happened, you are no longer observing the exercise. You are planning tomorrow, replaying yesterday, remembering an unfinished conversation, imagining a completely different future. Several minutes may pass before you realize that your attention quietly left the room without asking permission. Nothing dramatic occurred. No emergency interrupted you. No one called your name. No crisis demanded immediate action. Your own mind simply wandered. That observation is so common that most people dismiss it immediately. Haanel did not. He treated it as evidence. Not evidence that something was wrong with the mind, evidence that the mind behaved according to patterns most of us rarely examine. Think carefully about what has just happened. You made a decision. For the next few minutes, I will remain completely attentive. Only seconds later, another process inside the mind proposed something different. Not with violence, not with force, with suggestions, tiny negotiations, harmless distractions, reasonable alternatives, which raises a fascinating question. If every intention immediately encounters competing intentions, who is actually making the decisions? That question has occupied philosophers for thousands of years. The Stoics wrestled with it. Buddhist teachers approached it from another direction. William James described the constant movement of consciousness in remarkably similar language only a few years before Haanel published the Master Key system. Each tradition used different vocabulary. Each arrived at a similar observation. Human attention rarely remains where we deliberately place it. Haanel's contribution was not discovering that fact. His contribution was deciding to build an entire educational system around it. That decision may have been far more revolutionary than it first appears, because once attention becomes the starting point, everything else changes. Success is no longer primarily a financial question. It becomes an attentional question. Learning is no longer merely an intellectual question. It becomes an attentional question. Character is no longer explained only through personality. It becomes an attentional question. Even freedom begins taking on a different meaning. Most people imagine freedom as the ability to do whatever they choose. Haanel quietly asks another question. Can you actually choose if your attention goes wherever the strongest impulse sends it? That question deserves to linger, because it moves the discussion far beyond productivity or self-improvement. Imagine standing at the edge of a powerful river. The current is constantly moving. Leaves drift past without resistance. Small branches disappear downstream. Anything released into the water is carried away almost immediately. Now imagine planting your feet firmly on the riverbank. The current still exists, but you no longer move with it automatically. That image captures something essential about Haanel's first exercise. He never expected the current of thought to stop. He expected the observer to stop drifting with every current. That distinction is enormous. It changes the goal completely. The objective is not an empty mind. The objective is a mind that notices where it is being pulled before agreeing to follow. Read the first lessons of the Master Key System carefully enough, and a quiet pattern begins to emerge. Haanel almost never speaks about controlling the world. He speaks about controlling participation in the world. That difference is easy to overlook, yet it may explain why so many later interpretations of his work drifted toward ideas he himself never placed at the beginning of the course. Before wealth, attention. Before influence, attention. Before imagination, attention. Before changing circumstances, attention. It is almost as though Haanel believed that attention was the gateway through which every other human faculty had to pass, and perhaps that is why he refused to move forward until the reader had confronted a deeply uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the greatest obstacle to directing a life was never a lack of intelligence or opportunity or talent. Maybe it was something much quieter, the inability to remain with one chosen thought long enough for it to become deliberate action. If that possibility is true, then the first exercise of the Master Key System was never really about sitting still. It was a mirror reflecting something most people spend their entire lives without consciously observing. And once that reflection becomes impossible to ignore, another mystery begins to appear. Why did Charles Haanel believe attention deserved such extraordinary importance? To answer that question, we need to leave the quiet room where the experiment began and step into a world that, more than a century later, seems determined to capture attention every waking moment. Act 3. The Invisible Economy. There is a curious irony hidden inside Charles Haanel's work. When he published the Master Key System in 1912, he lived in a world almost unimaginably quieter than our own. No smartphones, no social media, no streaming platforms, no endless notifications competing for every spare second of the day. A letter might take days to arrive. A newspaper appeared once each morning. Even the pace of conversation was different. By modern standards, it was a remarkably slow civilization. And yet, Haanel believed attention was already becoming humanity's greatest challenge. That observation deserves to make us pause, because if directing attention required disciplined practice more than a century ago, what does that suggest about the world we inhabit today? Perhaps Haanel saw something that had very little to do with technology. Perhaps distraction was never fundamentally technological. Perhaps it was always psychological. Technology simply amplified a tendency that already existed. Think about how often the mind changes direction during an ordinary day. You begin reading a book. A memory interrupts. You return to the page. A sound outside the window captures your awareness. Moments later, another idea arrives. Without noticing it, your attention has traveled through half a dozen different subjects before the original sentence has fully settled into memory. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is simply the natural movement of an undirected mind. Haanel recognized that movement long before modern neuroscience could study it in laboratories. He did not condemn it. He simply refused to confuse it with freedom. That distinction becomes increasingly important as the course unfolds, because Haanel appears to make a claim that sounds almost backwards. Most people believe attention follows interest. Haanel suggests that interest often follows attention. Consider how many of the deepest interests in your own life began. Very few appeared fully formed. A language became fascinating only after weeks of study. Music became meaningful after learning to listen. History became compelling after understanding the stories behind the dates. The more attention invested, the more significance emerged. Attention did not merely follow value, it helped create value. That simple observation quietly transforms the way we understand almost every area of life. A marriage grows through attention. Friendships deepen through attention. Craftsmanship develops through attention. Ideas mature through attention. Even memory itself depends upon attention. What we never truly attend to rarely becomes part of us. Haanel repeatedly returns to this principle from different directions, almost as though he wants readers to recognize that attention is not merely another mental faculty. It is the gatekeeper. Nothing enters consciousness deeply without first passing through it. Nothing becomes habit without repeatedly receiving it. Nothing becomes character without long acquaintance. The gate determines what enters the city. The city eventually reflects the gate. This metaphor appears in different forms throughout history. Ancient philosophers spoke about guarding the mind. Religious traditions described watching over the heart. Modern psychologists discuss selective attention and cognitive filtering. Different centuries, different language, a remarkably similar concern. What deserves entrance? Haanel's answer was not to fear the world, it was to strengthen the one faculty responsible for choosing how the world would be received. That is a very different philosophy. It is the difference between hiding from distraction and becoming capable of meeting distraction without surrendering to it. Imagine two sailors crossing the same ocean. One spends every hour complaining about the wind, the other learns how to adjust the sails. Neither controls the weather, only one develops the capacity to navigate it. Perhaps Haanel believed the modern mind faced a similar choice. We cannot eliminate every distraction. We cannot silence every unexpected thought. We cannot control every circumstance that enters our lives. But we may be able to cultivate the ability to decide which of those circumstances deserves our continued attention. That ability changes more than productivity. It changes perception itself. There is an old story, told in slightly different forms across many cultures, about two travelers entering the same city. The first notices only decay, broken buildings, arguments, dishonesty. Every encounter confirms what he already expected to find. The second notices generosity, craftsmanship, unexpected beauty hidden in ordinary streets. The city has not changed, the travelers have. Or more precisely, their attention has. Haanel never claimed that attention invents reality out of nothing. His point was more subtle. Attention determines which parts of reality become psychologically real to us. What we repeatedly notice begins shaping expectation. Expectation influences interpretation. Interpretation guides action. Action accumulates into a life. That sequence is so gradual that it often feels invisible while it is happening. Only years later do people look back and wonder why two individuals standing at similar starting points slowly drifted toward remarkably different destinations. The explanation is rarely found in a single dramatic decision. It is found in thousands of unnoticed acts of attention. This is why Haanel insisted that the first victory was never over the world. It was over the direction of one's own awareness. Only then does another possibility begin to emerge. If attention can be deliberately guided, what happens when it remains fixed on a single idea, not for seconds, but for days, weeks, even years? That question leads us to the faculty Charles Haanel believed transformed attention into creative power, not imagination by itself, but concentration. Because attention may open the door, yet concentration is what allows someone to walk through it. Act 4. The forgotten power of concentration. There is a word that appears throughout the master key system with remarkable persistence. It is not a success. It is not wealth. It is not abundance. It is concentration. To a modern reader, the word can sound almost old-fashioned. It belongs to another era, an era of handwritten letters, quiet libraries, and long afternoons spent studying a single subject. Today, we rarely celebrate concentration. We admire speed. We admire multitasking. We admire the ability to answer messages while watching videos, listening to podcasts, and switching between a dozen browser tabs. Our culture has become extraordinarily efficient at dividing attention. Charles Haanel lived in a very different world, yet he arrived at a conclusion that feels almost prophetic. He believed the greatest source of human power was not intelligence, not education, not even imagination. It was the ability to hold the mind steadily upon one chosen object, long enough for that object to transform the thinker. That sentence deserves to be read slowly because it reverses the way many people think about learning. We usually imagine that we change ideas. Haanel quietly suggests that sustained attention allows ideas to change us. The distinction seems subtle. It is anything but. Think about the greatest craftsman in history, the violin maker who spends decades refining the sound of a single instrument, the architect who studies proportion until entire cities begin reflecting his vision, the mathematician who wrestles with one problem for years before discovering an elegant proof. From the outside, these achievements appear almost miraculous. From the inside, they are often the result of something much less dramatic, remaining with one question longer than most people are willing to remain. Haanel recognized this pattern everywhere. Great achievement rarely emerges from scattered effort. It emerges from prolonged coherence. Imagine sunlight falling across a field, warm, pleasant, yet relatively gentle. Now imagine taking that same sunlight and passing it through a magnifying glass. Nothing about the light itself has changed. The energy is the same. What changes is its organization. Scattered rays become focused, and suddenly something extraordinary happens. The concentrated light acquires the ability to ignite fire. Haanel appears to believe the human mind functions in much the same way. An unfocused mind possesses enormous potential. A concentrated mind possesses direction. The difference between the two is not the amount of energy available. It is whether that energy converges upon one purpose or disperses across hundreds. This idea appears repeatedly throughout the history of discovery. Isaac Newton spent years developing the ideas that became classical mechanics. Marie Curie devoted painstaking years to understanding radioactivity. Charles Darwin filled notebooks for decades before publishing On the Origin of Species. Their achievements were certainly products of intelligence, but intelligence alone explains very little. Many intelligent people begin remarkable projects. Far fewer remain with them long enough for those projects to mature. Haanel noticed the same pattern in ordinary life. The entrepreneur abandons one opportunity after another. The student continually changes direction. The artist starts dozens of unfinished works. The individual is busy, often highly motivated, yet little accumulates. Not because effort is absent, because attention never remains in one place long enough for effort to compound. Compounding. That is another word Haanel rarely uses explicitly, yet it quietly permeates his thinking. Most people understand compound interest because they can see numbers increasing over time. Haanel believed concentration creates something similar within the mind. Each return strengthens the previous return. Each period of uninterrupted attention makes the next one slightly easier. Each completed act of focus quietly expands the mind's capacity for future focus. Growth becomes cumulative. This may explain why Haanel repeatedly warns readers against impatience. The early exercises often feel almost insignificant. 5 minutes of stillness, 10 minutes of concentration, a carefully held mental image. The individual sessions appear too small to matter until viewed collectively. Imagine placing one drop of water upon a stone. Nothing changes. A second drop, still nothing. 1,000 drops, the surface begins to soften. Enough time passes, and even stone slowly yields. Not because any single drop possessed extraordinary force, because persistence accomplished what isolated effort never could. Haanel trusted persistence more than intensity. That is a lesson modern culture often struggles to appreciate. We are drawn toward dramatic breakthroughs, instant transformations, life-changing moments. They make compelling stories. Reality is usually quieter. Most meaningful changes occur below the threshold of immediate perception. The pianist does not suddenly become gifted. The scientist does not suddenly become insightful. The writer does not suddenly become eloquent. What changes, day after day, is almost impossible to measure, until one morning the accumulated effect becomes visible. Haanel believed concentration worked according to the same principle. Its greatest power was not what it accomplished in a single afternoon. Its greatest power was what it quietly reorganized over months and years. Perhaps that is why he insisted that concentration must always precede imagination. An unfocused imagination becomes fantasy. A concentrated imagination becomes design. Fantasy entertains possibility. Design prepares action. Those two paths may look similar in the beginning. Over time, they produce entirely different lives. This brings us to one of the most overlooked decisions Haanel ever made. He did not ask readers merely to imagine a better future. He first taught them how to remain with that future after excitement disappeared. Because anyone can hold an inspiring idea for a few moments, the real question is different. Who can still hold it after distraction, boredom, uncertainty, criticism, and ordinary life begin pulling attention somewhere else? For Haanel, that was where the real work began. And it is also where another mystery quietly emerges. If concentration gives the mind direction, what should that direction ultimately be aimed toward? That question leads us into the most misunderstood faculty in the master key system. Not concentration, not attention, but imagination, viewed not as fantasy, but as the architect of deliberate action. Act 5. Why imagination was never the beginning. If you ask someone familiar with Charles Haanel to summarize the master key system in a single sentence, there is a good chance they will mention imagination. Visualize your future, picture success, hold a mental image, create your reality from within. These ideas have become so closely associated with Haanel that many readers assume they form the foundation of his philosophy. But if we return to the original course, something surprising appears. Imagination is not the foundation, it is almost the reward. By the time Haanel begins asking readers to work deliberately with mental imagery, they have already spent weeks cultivating quieter abilities: stillness, observation, attention, concentration, self-command. This order was almost certainly intentional, because Haanel appears to distinguish between two very different kinds of imagination. The first belongs to everyone. It is automatic, restless, uninvited. It drifts constantly between memory and possibility. Without asking permission, it revisits yesterday's embarrassment. It invents tomorrow's catastrophe. It rehearses conversations that will never happen. It argues with people who are not present. It celebrates victories that never arrive. Most of us experience this kind of imagination every day. It is extraordinarily creative and completely undisciplined. Haanel never treats this faculty as a problem. He simply refuses to confuse it with deliberate creation. There is another kind of imagination, quieter, more intentional, less dramatic. It does not chase every possibility, it remains with one. That difference may seem almost insignificant. It is not. Imagine two architects standing before an empty piece of land. The first changes the design every morning, a different building, a different purpose, a different vision. Each new idea is exciting, none survives long enough to become concrete. The second architect spends months refining a single design. Each revision brings greater clarity. Every decision supports the previous one. Years later, one imagination produced endless possibilities, the other produced a cathedral. Haanel appears to suggest that the human mind works in much the same way. It is not the number of ideas that matters, it is their continuity, the ability to remain faithful to one organizing vision long after novelty has disappeared. That insight feels strangely modern. Today we are surrounded by more ideas than any previous generation. Thousands of books, millions of videos, unlimited information, infinite inspiration. Yet abundance often produces an unexpected consequence. The temptation to begin again. Every new idea feels like a better idea. Every new method promises faster results. Every new opportunity quietly interrupts the previous one. Without realizing it, people spend years collecting beginnings. Very few accumulate completion. Haanel seems almost immune to this temptation. Again and again, he returns to one principle. Stay with the work. Return to the exercise. Strengthen the faculty. Continue. It is not glamorous advice. It is remarkably effective advice. Because imagination in Haanel's system was never intended to replace action. It was intended to organize action. That distinction changes everything. Think for a moment about a bridge. Before a single beam is lifted into place, the bridge already exists. Not physically, structurally. Within drawings, measurements, relationships, the invisible design governs every visible decision that follows. Construction does not invent the bridge. Construction reveals it. Haanel appears to believe that meaningful human achievement follows a similar sequence. The imagination provides structure. Attention maintains that structure. Concentration protects it from fragmentation. Action gradually gives it physical expression. Remove any one of those elements, and the process weakens. This may explain why readers who rushed directly toward visualization often became disappointed. They inherited the blueprint without first strengthening the faculties required to build from it. Blueprints are essential, but no building has ever been completed by blueprints alone. There is another reason Haanel delays imagination until later in the course. An undisciplined imagination has no preference for hope over fear. It constructs both with extraordinary skill. Think about the amount of emotional energy people invest every day imagining outcomes they desperately hope will never occur. The presentation that goes terribly wrong, the medical diagnosis they have not received, the conversation that ends in rejection, the business that inevitably fails, hours of vivid mental rehearsal. Nothing has happened, yet the body often responds as though the imagined event were already unfolding. Heart rate changes, breathing changes, muscles tighten, sleep becomes restless. The imagination does not ask whether an image is useful before developing it. It simply develops what repeatedly receives attention. That observation may be one of the most psychologically sophisticated insights anywhere in the master key system. The imagination is always working. The real question is, who chooses its direction? That question returns us to the beginning of Haanel's entire architecture. Why stillness? Why observation? Why concentration? Because without them, the imagination becomes an extraordinarily powerful servant of accident. With them, it becomes an instrument of intention. Notice what has happened. The machine we began reconstructing is finally beginning to reveal its design. Stillness was not isolated. Attention was not isolated. Concentration was not isolated. Each one prepared the next. Every gear depended upon the one before it. And now, for the first time, we can begin to understand why Charles Haanel insisted that readers move through his course 1 week at a time. He was not asking them to memorize ideas. He was asking them to develop capacities that, once combined, could fundamentally change the way a human being perceived, decided, and acted. Which brings us to perhaps the most important question in the entire documentary. If these capacities can truly be developed, how do they stop being exercises and start becoming character? Because Haanel never intended readers to practice concentration forever. He intended concentration to become part of who they were. And that transformation from practice to identity may have been the real master key all along. Act 6. The person you repeatedly become. There is an assumption so deeply rooted in everyday life that we rarely think to question it. We believe we make decisions, and those decisions gradually shape our future. Charles Haanel would probably have agreed, but he would also have asked another question. Who is making those decisions? Because decisions do not emerge from empty space, they emerge from perception, from habits, from expectations, from beliefs so familiar that they no longer feel like beliefs at all. They simply feel like reality. That observation may explain why the master key system spends so little time trying to persuade readers to change individual actions. Haanel was aiming at something much deeper, the source from which actions continuously arise. Imagine two people walking into exactly the same opportunity. The opportunity is identical, the risks are identical, the potential rewards are identical, yet one immediately notices possibility, the other notices danger. One begins asking, how could this work? The other begins asking, what if everything goes wrong? Outwardly, they appear to be making different decisions. Inwardly, something far more significant has already happened. They are perceiving different worlds. That distinction becomes increasingly important the longer we study Haanel, because he appears less interested in isolated choices than in the invisible architecture that produces those choices again and again. Think about the word character. Today it often sounds moral, almost old-fashioned. Yet historically, the word carried another meaning. In ancient Greek, the term referred to an engraved mark, something impressed so deeply that it became part of the object itself. The metaphor is striking. Character is not a costume, it is an imprint. Haanel seems to understand character in much the same way, not as something inherited once and forever, but as something gradually engraved through repeated acts of attention. Every time attention returns to the same pattern, the engraving deepens. Every time a reaction becomes automatic, the pathway becomes easier to travel. Eventually, what began as a conscious effort no longer feels like effort at all. It feels natural. That word deserves careful attention. Natural. How often have we heard someone described as naturally confident, naturally disciplined, naturally patient, naturally creative? Perhaps those qualities once required extraordinary effort. Perhaps repetition quietly transformed discipline into identity. The change happened so gradually that even the person themselves eventually forgot the training behind it. This may be one of Haanel's most hopeful ideas. If character is constructed, then character can also be reconstructed. Not instantly, not dramatically, but deliberately. Consider a sculptor standing before a block of marble. No single strike of the chisel creates the finished figure. Thousands do. Most leave almost no visible difference. Only after months of patient work does the emerging form become recognizable. Looking back, the transformation appears astonishing. Living through it, each individual strike seemed almost insignificant. Haanel trusted this kind of gradual transformation more than sudden inspiration. He repeatedly directs readers away from emotional intensity and back towards steady practice. Observe, concentrate, return, repeat. The sequence almost resembles physical training, not because muscles are being strengthened, because attention is. This is where many readers expect Haanel to reveal a hidden secret. Instead, he quietly offers something much more demanding: consistency. There is nothing glamorous about consistency. It rarely produces dramatic stories. It rarely attracts headlines. Yet almost every extraordinary human achievement rests upon it. The violinist practices scales long after applause has faded. The scientist continues experimenting long after public excitement has disappeared. The craftsman returns to the workshop when no one is watching. The writer sits before a blank page on days when inspiration never arrives. Again and again, greatness seems less connected to moments of brilliance than to the willingness to continue after brilliance has disappeared. Haanel appears to recognize exactly the same principle within the mind. Attention is trained. Concentration is trained. Observation is trained. Character is trained. Not because people are machines, but because repeated experience quietly reorganizes how the mind meets the world. Notice how far we have traveled from the popular image of the master key system. This is not a book asking readers simply to think positively. It is asking them to become different participants in their own experience. That distinction changes everything, because if participation changes, decisions change. If decisions change, actions change. If actions change, patterns begin changing. Eventually, circumstances often begin changing as well. Not because reality suddenly obeys every wish, but because the individual meeting reality is no longer organized in the same way. This is where the machine we have been rebuilding since the beginning of this documentary finally begins to move. Stillness, attention, concentration, imagination, character. None of them were separate lessons. They were components, each one preparing the next, each one strengthening the entire structure. And once that structure begins operating as a whole, another question naturally appears, one that has fascinated readers of Haanel for more than a century. If an ordered mind gradually reshapes the person, how does that inner order begin expressing itself in the outer world? That question takes us to the most controversial, and perhaps the most misunderstood, part of Charles Haanel's philosophy. Because it is here that we encounter the idea many people remember, while forgetting everything that made it possible. Act 7. The most misunderstood idea in the master key system. There is a moment in almost every discussion of Charles Haanel when the conversation suddenly changes. Attention becomes attraction. Concentration becomes manifestation. Discipline becomes abundance. Some readers embrace that transition immediately. Others reject it just as quickly. Curiously, both reactions often skip the same question. What was Haanel actually trying to say? That question deserves patience, because it is surprisingly easy to read modern ideas back into books written more than a century ago. Words survive. Meanings evolve. Generations reinterpret old texts through new cultural lenses. By the time the master key system reached the 21st century, it was frequently introduced as one of the earliest manuals on what later became known as the Law of Attraction. There is certainly a reason for that. Haanel repeatedly argues that inner conditions influence outer experience. He writes about cause and effect. He describes thought as creative. He insists that mental habits eventually become visible in external circumstances. Those ideas are undeniably present. But there is another feature of the course that receives far less attention. Before Haanel discusses what thought may create, he spends weeks asking a simpler question. Can thought be governed at all? That sequence changes everything. Imagine meeting an architect who begins speaking enthusiastically about designing a skyscraper. Before discussing steel, Before discussing glass, before discussing engineering, he asks one unexpected question. Can you hold a pencil steadily? The question feels absurd until you realize what he is testing. Not architectural knowledge, control, precision, discipline. The skyscraper can wait, the hand cannot. Haanel appears to adopt exactly the same logic. Readers often rush toward the promises. He continually returns to the instrument, the mind itself. This is why one of the most important words in the master key system is not attraction. It is cause. Notice the difference. Attraction sounds passive. Cause sounds participatory. One waits, the other acts. Again and again, Haanel directs readers away from wishful thinking and back toward deliberate mental activity. Observe carefully, concentrate deliberately, imagine clearly, act consistently, repeat patiently. These are not the instructions of someone describing magic. They are the instructions of someone describing training. This distinction becomes even more important when we remember the intellectual world in which Haanel lived. The beginning of the 20th century was filled with extraordinary confidence in laws. Scientists searched for laws governing electricity. Chemists searched for laws governing matter. Economists searched for laws governing markets. Psychologists searched for laws governing behavior. The very word science carried enormous cultural authority. Haanel shared that fascination with order. He believed the inner life also followed recognizable principles. Whether those principles extended as far as he believed remains an open question. But his method remains remarkably consistent. He rarely asks readers to suspend reason. He asks them to perform experiments, observe the mind, practice concentration, notice the results, modify the practice, observe again. That rhythm resembles investigation far more than blind belief. Perhaps this explains why successful business people were drawn to his correspondence course. Business rewards observation, adjustment, feedback, iteration. Failure is not ignored. It becomes information. Haanel seems to apply the same attitude inwardly. The mind becomes something to study, not merely something to possess. This may also explain one of the greatest misunderstandings surrounding the master key system. Many readers search the book for techniques capable of changing reality. Haanel may have been trying to teach something even more fundamental, a method of changing the individual who continuously participates in reality. Those are not identical goals. Think about an experienced chess player. The board is the same, the pieces are the same, the rules never change. Yet the master repeatedly discovers possibilities the beginner cannot even see. Why? The board did not become more generous. The player became more perceptive. The opportunities were always present. The capacity to recognize them developed slowly through disciplined practice. Perhaps Haanel believed life itself worked according to a similar principle. An ordered mind notices what a distracted mind overlooks. A patient mind recognizes patterns, an impatient mind interrupts. A concentrated mind follows opportunities long after scattered attention has abandoned them. None of this requires us to deny uncertainty, or luck, or the role of circumstances beyond individual control. History clearly contains injustice, accident, privilege, misfortune. No serious philosophy can ignore them. Haanel did not live outside history, neither do we. But within those realities, he insisted that another set of causes remained available to every individual. The causes generated through attention, through interpretation, through deliberate action. This is where his philosophy becomes both demanding and liberating. Demanding because it asks readers to stop blaming distraction entirely on the outside world. Liberating because it suggests that the cultivation of attention remains possible even when circumstances cannot immediately be changed. That may be one of the most enduring ideas in the master key system. Not that thought magically replaces action, but that thought determines the quality of action before action ever becomes visible. And perhaps this explains why Haanel never hurried his readers toward abundance. He understood something that many later interpretations quietly forgot. Before the harvest, there must be cultivation. Before cultivation, there must be preparation. Before preparation, there must be attention. Everything returns to attention, everything. And if that is true, then we are finally ready to understand why Charles Haanel called his philosophy a system rather than simply a collection of ideas. Because systems are not judged by individual parts. They are judged by how those parts work together. That is where our investigation now turns. For perhaps the greatest insight hidden inside the master key system is not found in any single lesson. It is found in the relationship between all of them. Act 8. The machine hidden inside the 24 lessons. Imagine walking into an old workshop. On one table lies a collection of polished brass gears. Nearby, a series of springs, small screws, steel shafts, perfectly crafted components, each one impressive on its own. Now imagine someone asking you a simple question. What does this machine do? You couldn't answer. Not because the pieces are missing, because the relationship between the pieces is missing. A gear explains very little by itself. Its purpose only becomes clear once it is connected to every other gear around it. Perhaps that is the greatest mistake readers have made with the master key system. For more than a century, millions have admired individual ideas: concentration, visualization, cause and effect, creative thought, character, the subconscious. Each idea has been quoted, summarized, simplified, sometimes even transformed into entirely different philosophies. But Haanel rarely presented them as isolated truths. He assembled them. Like an engineer, every lesson prepares another. Every faculty strengthens another. Every exercise supports another. The system only reveals itself when viewed as a whole. Imagine removing the foundation from a cathedral. The stained glass windows remain beautiful. The carved stone columns remain magnificent. The vaulted ceiling still inspires admiration. Yet none of them can continue standing for very long. Not because the craftsmanship disappeared, because the invisible structure supporting the craftsmanship has been removed. That image captures something essential about Haanel's method. The structure matters as much as the ideas, perhaps even more. Notice the progression we have uncovered together. Stillness. At first it seemed almost trivial, yet stillness was never the destination. It interrupted automatic behavior. Once automatic behavior slowed, observation became possible. Observation revealed where attention actually moved. Once attention became visible, it could gradually be directed. Directed attention eventually became concentration. Concentration gave stability to imagination. Imagination provided continuity to intention. Repeated intention organized action. Repeated action slowly reshaped character. Character influenced decisions. Decisions accumulated into circumstances. Suddenly, what first appeared to be 24 independent lessons begins looking remarkably like a sequence of causes unfolding one after another. Nothing appears accidental. Nothing appears misplaced. Every lesson quietly assumes the previous one has already become part of the reader. This explains something that puzzled critics for decades. Why was Haanel so insistent that students complete the course in order? Why not simply read the final lesson first? The answer may be surprisingly ordinary. For the same reason a builder cannot install the roof before laying the foundation. The later lessons depend upon capacities the earlier lessons were designed to cultivate. Knowledge without capacity changes very little. Capacity transforms the meaning of knowledge. Think about learning mathematics. A child introduced to advanced calculus before mastering arithmetic will not suddenly become a genius. The ideas themselves are not impossible. The necessary mental structures have simply not yet been developed. Haanel appears to believe inner development follows the same principle. Every new capacity expands what the next lesson becomes capable of accomplishing. This is why the master key system often feels strangely repetitive. Readers sometimes assume Haanel is repeating himself because he lacks new material. Perhaps the opposite is true. Perhaps he keeps approaching the same faculties from different directions because repetition is gradually strengthening them. After all, this is how every meaningful form of training works. The concert pianist does not practice scales because scales are exciting. The athlete repeats familiar movements because repetition reorganizes the nervous system. The surgeon performs thousands of procedures because precision emerges from accumulated experience rather than isolated inspiration. Why should the mind develop differently? Haanel never expected extraordinary results from extraordinary moments. He expected extraordinary results from ordinary disciplines practiced extraordinarily well. This insight may explain why his work continues attracting readers despite the enormous changes that have taken place since 1912. Technology has transformed almost every aspect of human life. Our tools have changed, our economies have changed, our pace of life has changed. But the underlying challenge Haanel identified appears remarkably familiar. How does a person develop enough inner order to live deliberately rather than reactively? That question has not disappeared. If anything, it has become more urgent. Every generation inherits new distractions. The fundamental problem remains astonishingly similar. This is also where one final misunderstanding quietly dissolves. People often ask whether the master key system works. Haanel might have responded with another question. Which part? Does concentration improve through practice? Almost certainly. Can attention become more stable? Experience suggests it can. Can disciplined habits reshape character over time? History is filled with examples. Can clearer perception influence better decisions? Few would deny it. Notice what has happened. Without making a single extraordinary claim, the foundations of Haanel's entire architecture suddenly become much easier to understand. Whether one accepts every philosophical conclusion he drew from those foundations remains a personal decision, but the architecture itself reveals a remarkable coherence, a coherence often hidden beneath decades of simplified interpretations. Perhaps that coherence was the real master key, not a mystical secret, not an invisible force, a method, a sequence, a disciplined process through which one faculty gradually strengthens another until the individual begins responding to life with greater clarity, greater intention, and greater consistency. The machine is finally assembled. Now only one question remains. What happens when someone actually lives according to it? Because every system is ultimately judged in only one way, not by how elegant it appears on paper, but by the kind of human being it produces. And that is where Charles Haanel leaves us with his final challenge. Final act. The key was never hidden. There is something strangely revealing about the way history remembers ideas. Some survive because they are repeated faithfully. Others survive because they are simplified. Eventually, the simplified version becomes more famous than the original. Perhaps that is exactly what happened to the master key system. Generation after generation inherited fragments. Visualization, positive thinking, the law of attraction, creative thought. Each fragment contained something genuine, yet fragments are not systems. Imagine discovering the wheel of an old clock without ever seeing the clock itself. The wheel is authentic, beautifully crafted, historically important, but by itself, it can no longer tell time. The same may be true of Haanel's work. Over the last century, many readers inherited individual ideas while quietly losing sight of the architecture that gave those ideas their meaning. And perhaps that explains why the opening lesson now feels so surprising. Not because Haanel intended it to surprise, because we have become accustomed to beginning at the end. We expected techniques, he offered discipline. We expected promises, he offered practice. We expected extraordinary secrets. He directed attention toward ordinary faculties that most of us use every day without ever deliberately training them. That choice now appears less accidental than ever, because every investigation eventually arrives at a moment when the evidence begins pointing in only one direction. This is that moment. Everything we have examined, the historical context, the correspondence course, the 24-week progression, the insistence on stillness, the repeated exercises, the emphasis on concentration, the gradual introduction of imagination, the discussion of character, the language of cause rather than wish. All of it appears organized around one central conviction. A disordered mind cannot consistently produce an ordered life. That sentence may be the closest thing we have found to the hidden blueprint beneath the master key system. Notice what it does not say. It does not promise that disciplined people never suffer. History immediately disproves that. It does not promise wealth, or health, or certainty. Life has never offered such guarantees. Instead, Haanel proposes something both more modest and perhaps far more powerful. The quality of our participation in life can be cultivated, not perfectly, not completely, but deliberately. That distinction matters because there is an enormous difference between controlling life and becoming more capable of meeting life. One seeks certainty, the other develops capacity. Haanel always seems more interested in capacity. Capacity to observe before reacting, capacity to remain with one idea after excitement fades, capacity to choose attention rather than surrender it automatically, capacity to persist long enough for invisible causes to become visible effects. These capacities rarely attract attention because they develop quietly. No applause accompanies them. No dramatic transformation announces their arrival. Often the individual themselves notices very little from one day to the next. Only months later, or years later, looking backward, does the new pattern become obvious. This is one of the reasons history often misunderstands disciplined work. People see the outcome. They rarely witness the accumulation. A concert pianist appears effortless. The audience does not hear the scales practiced in an empty room. A scientist receives recognition. Few remember the countless failed experiments that quietly prepared the discovery. A writer publishes a remarkable book. Readers rarely imagine the mornings when nothing worthwhile seemed to appear on the page. The visible achievement becomes famous. The invisible discipline disappears from memory. Perhaps the same thing happened to Haanel himself. His conclusions became famous. His method slowly faded into the background. And yet, methods matter. Because methods can be practiced, ideas may inspire, methods transform. That difference may explain why the master key system continues finding new readers long after the world that produced it has disappeared. Not because modern life resembles 1912, in almost every visible respect, it does not, but because one challenge remains remarkably unchanged: the struggle to direct attention intentionally in a world constantly competing to direct it for us. In that sense, Haanel's first exercise may be more relevant today than when he first mailed it to his students. A century ago, remaining still for 15 minutes required patience. Today, for many people, it requires something closer to resistance. Resistance against interruption, against novelty, against the constant invitation to divide attention into smaller and smaller fragments. Perhaps Haanel could never have imagined smartphones, but he understood distraction. He understood that the human mind naturally follows movement, unless it is gently trained to choose direction instead. That insight feels less like history and more like diagnosis. So where does that leave us? After nearly an hour together, after reconstructing one of the most influential mental training systems of the early 20th century, what remains? Perhaps not certainty. Good documentaries rarely end by pretending every question has been settled. Instead, they leave us with a better question than the one we started with. We began by asking why Charles Haanel spent the opening weeks of the Master Key system teaching stillness instead of success. Now we can ask something far more personal. If Haanel were alive today, would he begin anywhere else? Or would he still start exactly where he began more than a century ago, with the simplest and perhaps the most demanding question in the entire course? Can you remain with one deliberate thought, long enough for it to become a deliberate life? Perhaps that is the real meaning of the Master Key. Not a hidden force waiting to be discovered, not a secret reserved for a select few, but a quiet discipline, available to anyone, demanding from everyone, waiting patiently, every time we choose, even for a single moment, to direct our own attention instead of allowing the world to direct it for us. Because, in the end, Charles Haanel may never have been offering a shortcut to success. He was offering something much rarer, a method for becoming the kind of person who no longer depends on shortcuts. And perhaps that is why, more than 100 years later, the Master Key system still deserves to be read. Not as a book of promises, but as an invitation to discover that the first world we must learn to govern has never been outside us. It has always been within.